Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? Violet and I have been going for walks before 5 a.m. all this week. I know which of my neighbors leave their damned lights on all night and which appear as vacant as the proverbial void once the small hours creep up. Too bad I'm not a burglar. This morning we were treated to a ghastly yellow moon sitting atop a layer of thin, anemic clouds. I would have taken a pic, but it never would have conveyed the majesty. We stood still for a minute while I just soaked it in. I think Violet just wanted to keep going. There were, after all, things she hadn't yet sniffed. Speaking of Violet, we have finally succumbed to the realization that she is a toddler that can leap, jump over baby gates, and scramble through areas you didn't think she'd fit through. In other words, we have a dog in the midst of the human terrible twos. At least she no longer shits in the house. Progress, right? With that, I'm going to let you get back to that dang old oil rig. My understanding is things ain't going well over there. Let's see, shall we? Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 16 of The Black.
Cigar smoke drifted from the deck and swirled upwards around the bright, white halogen lights before the ocean breeze spirited it away. Calhoun pulled the macanudo from his lips and exhaled through his nostrils. Shauna wrinkled her nose, but said nothing. Catfish sat in the middle of the circle, a laptop propped on his knees. The lid was closed, and his fingers kept tapping against its aluminum surface. She fought the urge to look behind her, but knew if she saw anything, she'd scream. They'd been exposed to the night for 3 hours now. The work lamps were so bright she couldn't even see the moon. With all the clouds racing across the sky, she wasn't surprised. The last weather report Gomez had listened to on the bridge said the storm was coming. The first bands of rain would probably hit them before dawn. Shauna shivered. Cold wind, cold rain. That was going to be so much fun around 4 a.m., if they survived that long. While everyone was sitting in the circle of light, that didn't mean everyone believed what Vrabel and Calhoun had told them. She thought at least half the remaining deck crew thought the two men had gone off their collective rockers. 4 of them lay sleeping on the deck. The others sat staring at one another or out into the darkness. They hadn't spoken a word in over an hour. "What are we doing here, Chief?" a burly blond man asked once darkness had fallen. Vrabel glanced at him. "Waiting out the night, Bill." "Waiting out the night." "The fuck does that mean, boss?" Vrabel sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." One of the other men, a rail-thin man with huge biceps, snorted. "Rig quake? That fucked up oil?" He shook his head. "I'll believe anything right now." So we told them. After that, they just checked out. Bill looked afraid to say anything. Jack, the thin guy, had been the same way. The rest? While Vrabel told the story, they'd rolled their eyes. Some had even chuckled and only stopped when the chief glared at them. Shauna checked her watch. 6 hours until dawn. She looked over at Vrabel. He was staring at the deck, his lips moving in silent words. "I have an idea," Calhoun said. The circle of people all looked at him in startled surprise. He ignored the stares, eyes fixed firmly on Shauna. "Assuming the light keeps it away, we should be able to move about during the day without a problem." "Big assumption," Shauna said, although since the samples in the lab reacted so violently to it, I think it's correct. Vrabel harumphed. "What makes you think these halogens," he said, pointing at the tripods, "are doing anything like that?" Shauna noticed that Calhoun's fingers were trembling. He took a deep drag on the cigar and let the smoke creep out of his mouth. He glanced over Vrabel's shoulder. "Because it hasn't attacked." She slowly turned her head and looked where her boss's eyes were fixed. "I don't see—" She stopped, the words dying in her throat. It was difficult to make out, but there was a shadow a few feet away from the circle of light. She squinted and then nearly screamed. A shape, blacker than the darkness, stood behind Vrabel. It was solid, but amorphous at the same time. It stood on 3 legs, its body squat and low to the ground. Appendages waved from its top half. She couldn't be sure, but she thought it was the size of 3 men, maybe more. It seemed to stretch out into the distance, but it was impossible to tell how far. "Oh, my God," Shauna said. She stared back at Calhoun. Vrabel was looking over his shoulder. The ruddy color in his cheeks had faded. Is that—" he started to say, and then gulped hard. The rest of the men in the circle were looking too. One by one they seemed to see it, jaws dropping open. Calhoun patted his knee and took another drag on the nearly spent cigar. "I think it has us surrounded." Jack got to his knees and then stood. "Don't leave the circle," Calhoun said to the wiry man. Jack blinked at him and then faced the darkness. "What the hell is it?" he asked. "I don't know," Calhoun said. "Something old. Very old, and I don't think the oil is all of it. I think it's part of it. But something else is down in the ocean. I've no idea what." Jack glanced back at him. "Something like what?" Calhoun shook his head. "Like I said, I don't know." Vrabel's phone rang, making everyone jump. He pulled it out of his pocket and stared at it. He slid his finger across the screen and put it to his ear. "Gomez?" he said. Shauna watched as Vrabel's eyes widened. The man bit his lip. "Okay, thanks," he said and put the phone down. He pointed to the bridge above them. "Gomez says we're fucked." Catfish grunted, like we didn't already know that. Vrabel glared at the tech and then stared around the circle. "It's getting closer," he said. His eyes found Calhoun's. "You're right about us being surrounded." "How's Gomez holding up?" Calhoun asked. "I guess he and Terrell are safe," he chuckled. "Safer than us, anyway. The bridge is made of steel and glass. Nothing's getting in there." "So he can see it?" Shauna asked. "I mean, around us?" "Yeah," Vrabel said. He looked up at Jack. "Sit down, man. You're attracting it." Jack glanced at the rig chief. "I don't know what—" Something shot out of the darkness and splatted against Jack's chest. He turned to the others in horror as they scrambled away from him. The smell of cooking flesh and something fetid filled the air. He clutched at his chest as his clothes caught fire. Bill grabbed the man's legs, pulled him to the deck and patted at the flames. "Jack!" he yelled and rolled him over, chest to the light. Jack's mouth opened in a silent scream. Tendrils of black flashed out of the darkness and grabbed the burning man's head. The sound of pine knots combusting in a fireplace was barely audible beneath Bill's shouts. The tentacles caught fire as they pulled the burning man's body out of the circle. "Jack!" Bill screamed again. There was no response. Out in the darkness, they could hear the sound of bacon frying in a pan and the crackling of bones breaking. Bill reached a hand beyond the circle of light. Catfish grabbed his leg and pulled him back to the center of the circle. The man flung a fist and smashed the side of Catfish's head. He shook it off and kept pulling until Bill was safely in the center. Vrabel and one of the other deck workers tackled the man, keeping him still. Bill was yelling. Vrabel looked down at him. "He's gone," the rig chief screamed. "He's gone!" Bill's eyes went wide. What the fuck was that?" Calhoun's cigar had fallen to the deck. It looked like a brown turd, the end still smoking. He shuffled a little closer to the inner circle, as did everyone else, including Shauna. Calhoun was shaking. Shauna put her arm around his shoulder. Vrabel looked at each of the roughnecks. "Everyone believe us now?" No one said a word. Tequila. That was the cure. A bottle of Tres Generaciones Añejo was exactly what he needed. Too bad no booze was allowed on the ship. Gomez sat in the captain's chair, eyes riveted on the circle of light glowing from the deck below. Terrell sat in the corner of the room, head in his hands. As they watched the attack, the man's resolve had folded like a cheap tortilla. Gomez couldn't blame him. He had clutched the medallion in his palm tight enough to draw blood. Jack Hosley was dead, that much was certain. From high above the circle of light, he and Terrell had watched as the shadows gathered on the light's edge before it attacked. Whatever it was, when it had dragged Hosley's body into the darkness, clouds of whitish smoke wafted upward into the breeze. He tried to warn them, even made the phone call Vrabel had told him not to make unless it was absolutely dire. Once Catfish walked Terrell through setting up a VoIP stream via the Wi-Fi, They'd decided conversation would only kill the phone batteries. Trapped on the deck, Vrabel and his circle had no way to recharge them. Now Jack Hoseley was dead. Gomez couldn't tell, but it looked like Bill Compton was hurt too, and dawn was still hours away. They'd heard something scratching at the hatch over an hour ago. Whatever it was gave up after 10 minutes or so. He thought both he and Terrell were going to shit themselves when it started. Now, that seemed laughable after what they'd seen down on the deck. Gomez brought up the computer. The Wi-Fi was live, but there was still no connection to the outside world. Except for corporate email, all other ports had been closed off. Catfish had tried to carry SSH traffic over 587 and connect to another server outside the corporate firewall, but hit a dead end. PPE wasn't allowing any traffic that wasn't mail. And they weren't exactly getting any of that, either. Gomez, Vrabel, and Calhoun had all sent messages to Simpson and other PPE executives requesting evac. Thus far, nothing. No response. It was as if the mails had never been sent. Gomez had asked Vrabel via text why PPE wasn't responding. The rig chief's assessment? They're deciding what to do with us. The email regarding the Houston quarantine had been vague to say the least. The line commanding Vrabel to prepare for evacuation now seemed like a lie to give them hope. Hope. Gomez fingered the medallion. Hope was all but gone. The air on the bridge was souring. He didn't know if the AC intakes were picking up rotten food from the kitchen or... Gomez decided he didn't want to know. Whatever that shit was he'd seen in the hallway and on the deck, he didn't want to know what it did to his victims. Gomez jumped in his chair when the computer dinged. New message, the screen said. Dios mío, he muttered under his breath. His shaking fingers clicked the mouse button and the email text filled the screen. To crew of PPE rig number 2785, Leaguer. Sent status report and known head count of crew. All documents related to oil extraction and any incidents are needed by emergency personnel in Houston. The Center for Disease Control is now in charge of all matters related to PPE rig number 2785, Leaguer. In order to plan a successful evacuation scenario, we require as much data as possible. Terrell was reading over his shoulder. Holy shit, he giggled. They're coming for us. Gomez turned to him. Maybe. What do you mean, maybe? The XO said and clapped him on the back. It's right there. He pointed at the screen. So is the fact the CDC's now in charge. Gomez rubbed his fingers across the medallion's face. Terrell's manic smile faltered. So? Gomez shrugged. I don't know. But Something scratched on the wall. Gomez and Terrell turned toward the starboard side. The fetid stench flowing through the AC duct intensified. Gomez's heart rate increased. The scratching noise came again. Gomez said, Where the hell is that coming from? Terrell's frightened eyes scanned the ceiling. You think it's trying to get in from above us? Gomez shook his head. Can't. Vrabel said he can't go through metal or glass. I don't think... The metal AC vent cover rattled. Fuck me, Gomez said. He backed away from the wall and grabbed his phone. We need to get out of here. A thin line of black ooze drizzled through the grate. It touched the hard floor and sizzled. Gomez ran to the supply cabinet and threw it open. He grabbed a heavy black cylinder and turned back toward the far wall. Terrell stood in front of the captain's chair. Move, pendejo, Gomez yelled. The XO didn't move, his eyes fixed on the vent as if in a trance. Move! Gomez screamed. A river of ooze poured through the grate and puddled on the floor. The puddle started to crackle and ripple. Gomez pushed Terrell to the side and pointed the halogen flashlight at the black. The puddle contracted as a jagged tube rose from the surface. It waved toward the two men and an eye popped into existence. It blinked, and then the tentacle reached for them. Gomez flicked on the flashlight. A narrow beam of strong white light shot out and hit the tentacle in its eye. The puddle of black slunk away as the tentacle smoked. Its eye disappeared back into the tentacle. Terrell screamed. He stumbled over his own feet and fell to the floor. Gomez tried to keep the flashlight pointed at the base of the tentacle as he grabbed Terrell by the shirt collar and dragged him across the floor. The beam of light wobbled and then moved off the target. The puddle stopped smoking and began moving forward. The tentacle raised in the air and smashed down into the floor with a heavy plop. Gomez shifted his gaze from Terrell's screaming, trembling body. The tentacle no longer had an eye. Instead, its end tapered to a fine point with jagged edges. Gomez shouted as it raised and hit the floor again mere inches from his heavy boots. He loosened his grip on Terrell and aimed the flashlight back at the puddle. The sound of bacon frying in deep grease filled the room. The tentacle slashed down again and this time caught Terrell in the meat of his bicep. The XO shrieked as the tentacle drew him backward. Gomez dropped the flashlight and pulled on Terrell's boot. "No, fucker!" he shouted. Terrell screamed in pain, caught between the tentacle pulling him one way and Gomez the other. Blood geysered out of Terrell's arm as the jagged tentacle ripped through flesh, muscle, and bone. Crimson droplets pattered into the puddle where they pulsed and then disappeared. The tentacle severed the arm near the shoulder and dragged its prize back into itself. The remaining skin sizzled and dissolved. Tissue and bone were the last to go, but it was finished in seconds. Gomez continued dragging Terrell's screaming, shaking body toward the port side. The puddle rippled and then slid forward, its tentacle searching for a new target. Gomez dropped his charge and scrambled for the flashlight. His fingers came within an inch of it before the tentacle slammed down into the floor. The puddle rippled and popped again. A smaller tentacle rose from its surface, a green and black eye staring from the end of the stalk. The blade-shaped tentacle wavered in the air and then pointed at him as the eye found him. He lunged for the flashlight just as the tentacle slammed down beside it. His left pinky finger touched the side of the tentacle. Flesh started to melt from his hand. Screaming, he lifted the flashlight with his other hand and pointed the beam straight at the eye. The orb smoked before vaporizing in a flash of light and white smoke. The jagged tentacle whipped around and sliced through the front of his shirt. He shrieked louder as he held his ruined left hand against the cut in his chest, but still managed to keep the flashlight's beam pointed at the eye stalk. It retreated into the puddle, and then the entire mess of goo slid backwards toward the shadows beneath the coffee table. He advanced toward it, the flashlight shaking in his hands. The black ooze hit the wall and then slid upwards back into the AC vent. It disappeared, leaving smoke and scorched drywall in its wake. "Help me," a voice said from behind. Gomez whirled, the flashlight beam lighting Terrell's face. Blood poured from the stump where his bicep should have been. Gomez pulled off his belt and cinched it around Terrell's arm. "Jesu Christi," he muttered. The blood slowed, but not enough. Terrell's eyes fluttered. His weather-beaten skin was no longer tan, but pale. "Don't you die on me, pendejo," Gomez yelled in Terrell's face. The XO's eyes closed. He took in a large, shuddering breath as his body bucked and shook. The smell of shit and piss wrinkled Gomez's nose, and then Terrell's body relaxed. The man's eyes stared up at the ceiling, but there was nothing in them. The sudden silence on the bridge was enough to let him hear the puddle sliding in the ductwork. It was gone, for now. Gomez sat on his ass next to Terrell's corpse, tears welling from his eyes. "Fucking pendejo," he said. His breathing was too fast and his heart raced. Gomez pulled off his shirt and looked down. A long line of burned flesh spread from beneath his left underarm and to the right side of his waist. Blood didn't seep from the wound, but it hurt like hell. Gomez held up his left hand. His pinky had been cut in half lengthwise. Bone protruded from missing skin and muscle. He shuffled backward to the wall and turned off the flashlight. The thing would be back. He was sure of it. He pulled the phone out of his pocket and started to type, his eyes jumping back to the grate with each word. He wasn't sure how long he could stay conscious, but he had to, or it was all over. It was outside the hatch. Every few minutes, Subkowiak heard it sliding against the metal as it tried to find a crack, a crevice, any gap it could use to get through. But he was safe, for now. He lay on the examination table, a scalpel in one hand. He knew the knife wouldn't do anything against what he'd seen, but it still made him feel better. If nothing else, he could slit his own throat before the creature got to him. He'd eyed the prescriptions and tranquilizers when he'd run back from the alley. It would be a painless way to go. Inject an overdose of morphine and simply slip off into... the black? He shivered. It was a word, just a word. But black was the absence of color, the absence of light, the absence of everything. But the black moved. The black was alive. Subkowiak tapped the scalpel against his knee. When the CDC email had come in, he'd stared at it and reread it so many times he knew every syllable it contained. "We require as much data as possible," the email had said. "Bullshit," Subkowiak said aloud. It didn't take a PhD to read between the lines. If they were willing to admit the Houston lab had been quarantined, requesting data from Ground Zero meant they had no idea what it was or how to stop it. Evacuation? Bullshit. He brought the scalpel up before his eyes. The blade was bright steel and suicidally sharp. The rig had become a gangrenous limb. You could clean it. You could cut out the diseased parts, but the rot would just spread. And in the end, you'd have to amputate. Amputation was the answer. It was the only answer. If the CDC didn't understand that, they would soon. And then what? Would they drop a fuel air bomb on the rig? Or send a submarine to sink it with a torpedo? Subkowiak chuckled. How pissed off would Greenpeace be if the American government sank a fucking oil rig? There would be a cover-up. PPE would likely go bankrupt under mysterious circumstances. The executives would be sworn to silence, paid off. God only knows what. The world couldn't afford to know about the black. It would bring the oil industry to a complete and utter halt. The world economy would collapse. No more cars, no more trucks, no more gas stations. Subkowiak touched the cold blade to the tip of his finger. A person could survive without a finger. Hell, remove all 4 limbs and a person would be able to live. It would be hellish, certainly, but life would remain. But cut out the heart of business and locomotion? It would be a cut the world couldn't afford. Something scratched at the hatch. Subkowiak glanced over at it. The white rectangular steel door didn't move. The scratching sound continued. He shifted his legs off the bed, stood, and slowly approached the door. He reached it and put his ear against the metal. The scratching sound was something else. Sizzling. Frying. White noise from a television tuned to a dead station. The metal door grew warm. The doctor pulled away from the hatch and walked back to his desk. He turned on the computer and sat down in the black ergonomic chair. The screen lit up as the hard drive whirred. He put on his glasses and stared at the screen. He brought up the email client, found the message from the CDC, and hit reply. He typed as the thing continued scratching at the door. Before he sent the email, he said a prayer to a god he didn't believe in. 2 hours had passed since the attack. The group was pushed together so closely their feet touched. Within the center of the circle, bathed in light, they were fairly safe. Or so Calhoun hoped. They could hear it sliding around on the deck. At one point, they heard what sounded like footsteps, but the creature didn't appear. Moving into the center of the circle of light had shattered their night vision. Beyond the tripods was little more than shadows and utter darkness. The moon was high in the sky, but its wan light barely penetrated the blanket of clouds that raced from horizon to horizon. Calhoun wanted to check his phone again, see if there was another response from PPE or the CDC or whoever the fuck was now in charge. But his battery was already down to 15%. Best to save it. Catfish had opened his laptop several times to check on the AUVs. The 3 that remained in the water had surfaced hours ago. Calhoun had asked him if they could look at the image data, but Catfish didn't want to waste the battery. Instead, he brought up the seismic reports. What they said made little sense, like every other fucking thing that had happened. Once the thing below the ocean floor had attacked the drill string, the trench had shifted again. The data didn't tell them how it had reconfigured itself, but Calhoun didn't need to know. AUV-5 had reported that the drill string was still in the ground. How far it had punched through the ocean floor was still unknown. When the rig quake happened, those sensors had been damaged. Harrowbin knew how far they had drilled, but he was gone. Calhoun wished he had another cigar and a single malt, or better yet, a port. He grunted at the thought. They were surrounded by something malevolent that could tear them to pieces or dissolve their flesh, and he was thinking about his favorite after-dinner routine. He looked up from the deck and out into the darkness. 3 hours. 3 more hours and the sun would start to rise in the east. The clouds may have blanketed the sky, but he was sure enough UV light would make it through to harm the thing, maybe even kill it, but only if they could keep it from getting back inside the rig structure. Once inside, it would have plenty of places to hide. "Once inside," he said aloud. "What?" Shauna asked. He looked over at her and grinned. "Nothing, just thinking." "About what?" Her face was lined with worry, but her eyes were steely. Calhoun once again patted himself on the back for hiring her. "I do have a question for you." "Okay, shoot." He pointed up to the bridge. "Gomez said they were attacked by something much smaller than what we have out here." "Yeah, so?" "What if," he said, "each person that was, infected, became a different entity?" Shauna opened her mouth and then closed it. She raised her eyes to the sky, tongue clicking against her teeth. "That would mean there are—" She paused and then looked back at him. "At least 4 other creatures, all smaller than the one out here." Calhoun nodded. "I think that's a fair assumption. JP and the 3 mud workers were infected. However this thing reproduces, it must have used them for food to grow. And this one," she pointed into the darkness, "had a huge meal." Catfish tapped on his laptop. "Then why aren't they out here joining the fun?" "Good question," Calhoun said. "Maybe they just haven't gotten around to it yet." "Like they need to," Vrabel said. "Doc and Gomez are still in there. Maybe some others." God damn it, he wanted a cigar. Calhoun rubbed a hand across his forehead. He was getting a migraine, and it didn't seem like sleep was in his future. "At least it didn't get Terrell," Vrabel hissed. "Oh, I beg to differ. The man's dead." "Sorry," Calhoun said. "That's not what I meant. I meant that what attacked him and Gomez didn't get to feed. At least not much." The rig chief looked up at the bridge. "Gomez is trapped up there and we can't get to him. He could be dying and there's nothing we can do." Calhoun nodded. "We'll get him come daylight." "Just how are we going to do that?" one of the deck crew asked. Calhoun turned to the large black man sitting across from him. "Those things could be anywhere in there." A smile tugged at the corners of Calhoun's lips. "We have weapons," he said, and pointed to the tripods. The rest of the group followed his gaze. "You're kidding," Vrabel said. "Tell me you're kidding." "I think we're going to have to light the way," Calhoun said. "Catfish?" The tech looked up from the deck and to his boss. "Yeah? We need to send the CDC some info. You and Shauna get started on that report. Tell them everything we know, but don't tell them how many are presumed infected." "Why?" Shauna asked. "Because if they know," Calhoun frowned, "they'll just blow us out of the water."